In this lecture snippet, I'm going to do a basic overview of an NTFS partition. Now, we would typically find this partition on a hard drive of a computer where we would have had a Microsoft Windows operating system installed. And so NTFS was created by Microsoft, the New Technology File System, and it's their method for writing or putting structure to the partition so that they can write and read data and files and organize that in a way that the operating system can recognize. And what I show here is a linear layout of the partition beginning with the boot sector. So the very first sectors of the partition will contain information on how to boot up the operating system that's located on this partition and load it up into your computer's memory. Following that, we have what's called the master file table. Now, the master file table contains a record of every folder and every file on your operating system, and so it keeps track of every one of those in here. If it's small enough, the file itself, it'll stay in the MFT, but most typical files we'll find in this area that I have called just data. And so we will typically find all kinds of files written all over the hard drive outside of the master file table. And then at the very end of this partition, we have a repeat of the very first sector we have in this boot sector. So a part of this boot sector gets rewritten for replication. And so the boot sector is going to be made up of the very first 16 sectors of your partition. And you can see they're numbered 0 through 15. So we start counting by 0. And sector 0 is that sector that actually gets repeated at the end of our partition. So that's the one that gets repeated. And we see all kinds of information that's going to give the computer basically the code and the information of where the operating system is and how to load it up so that the computer can load your operating system into RAM while it's booting itself up. And so we'll find things like the jump instruction or the original equipment manufacturer ID. We'll find this BIOS parameter block, which is going to contain information about how big a sector is and how many sectors will belong to a cluster, and then the physical makeup of the actual disk itself. So we'll find all of this information, which is going to be used for booting up the operating system into RAM on the very first 16 sectors of our computer. And so after the boot sector, we have an area called the master file table, or the MFT. And this is the area that actually keeps a record of every file and every folder or every object that Microsoft has on its operating system will have a record stored in this master file table. Now, when we first start off with Microsoft, the master file table is typically about 12.5% of your hard drive. That's what's reserved for it. And then, of course, with the need for a larger or bigger space, if we have more files that need to be recorded, it can actually grow up to about half of your disk space. So it's going to be different in size, but it does start off about 12.5% and can grow up to about half of your partition's size. And like I said before, every file and every folder and every object is stored in this master file table. Now, like what we saw with the boot sector, where the first 16 sectors were special, again we have the first 16 records as being special records in our master file table. The first record, you see record 0 here. Record 0 contains information about the master file table itself. And we'll see a lot of other things listed in here, like record 1, the second record in this table, is actually going to contain information about a mirror or a duplicate master file table so that we could actually recover in the event that our first master file table has corrupted. And we can see other information in here about recovery from failures or system failures, volume information. We can see different attributes where the root folder is located, which clusters have been used on the partition. We can see where the bad clusters are in the partition, information about lowercase and uppercase characters. A lot of different things are stored here in the very first 16 records of our master file table. Now, I want to point out that when we save a file on our computer or we work with an object in our computer, it will have a record stored in this master file table. And they're easy to identify. If we look through the master file table, we'll see an ASCII code called file 0, and that's usually what starts every one of our records. So it's identified by file. Even if it's a folder, it will be identified by file. And our records are typically 2 sectors long, and a sector is going to be 512 bytes, so our records are going to be about 1024 bytes long. And every one of our files and every one of our folders and every one of our objects contains attributes. We've got metadata information, we've got information about when the file was created, altered, modified. We've got file names, we've got permission and ownership rights, we've got a lot of different things about the files here. The 80 attribute that you see here contains information about where the actual file is located in this data area, or if it's located in the MFT itself. And so all this information is stored in the master file table. Now, this data area, well, the data area is going to contain the files that can't fit within the MFT. And so if the file is bigger than 512 bytes, Typically, it will not be stored in the master file table. It'll be stored outside of it into just an area of data that we have on our hard drive. So it'll be writing different cluster areas on a hard drive, and the file will be stored somewhere in this data area. And then that 80 attribute that I mentioned will point to where that file is located. So if it's smaller than 512 bytes, a file, it usually is stored in the master file table, or can be stored in the master file table, and it's what's called a resident file. If it's larger than the 512 bytes, it will be stored outside of the master file table, and it will be called a non-resident file. So we'll see that information there. So this is a basic overview of an NTFS partition and the basic layout of what we would typically find in the partition itself.